One morning in 1991, police in Ogden, Utah raided a quiet suburban subdivision. They had been tipped off that there was a cult that had taken over most of this neighborhood and turned it into a compound. Dozens of men, women, and children were found, but one notable person who was missing was the cult's leader, Arvin Shreve. This short, balding 61-year-old grandpa with glasses you would never assume could be dangerous at all. But Arvin was actually extremely dangerous, and the horrific, disgusting crimes committed by this cult completely shocked the nation. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Summer Sanchez, and on this channel we talk about crime cults and heinous history. And today we're talking about the Zion Society cult led by a man named Arvin Shreve. Arvin was once a member of the LDS Church, but he was excommunicated, so he decided to start up his own group, the Zion Society. And after researching this case, I can't believe that this cult isn't talked about more.
Behind the beautiful gardens and immaculate facades in one quiet suburb about 40 miles north of Salt Lake City, something far from heavenly was taking place.
And that is what we'll be talking about today. But before we get into the story, let's go ahead and briefly talk about today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by MeUndies. My favorite time of the year is finally here. It's officially fall, which means oversized sweatshirts and joggers for me. And having fall-themed MeUndies on underneath just kind of completes the vibe. Their micromodal fabric is super lightweight and breathable, and they offer so many cute prints as well. And since it's October, they have lots of cute Halloween-themed pieces to choose from, like the spiderweb all over lace, and they even have glow-in-the-dark prints, which I think is really fun. But this is my favorite from the Halloween collection. This print is called Magic Spell, and I just love the design and I love the fit of these. I chose the hipster cut for the underwear, and I chose a matching scoop bralette. And I just think this set is adorable and it's perfect for Halloween. But what I love most about MeUndies is how soft and cozy the fabric is. It has a stretch to it, it's supportive, but it's not uncomfortably so. The MeUndies signature super soft micromodal fabric is very breathable, it's stretchy, and it's unbelievably cozy, which makes them perfect to wear on a cool fall morning or a chilly night and everything in between. And I love that they offer all of their designs in a variety of cuts. So if you want something with a little more coverage, you can choose the hipsters or the boy shorts. But on the days when you feel like wearing something with a little less coverage, they offer cheeky briefs and thongs and so much more. They offer over 20 different styles and 100 different colors and prints, so there's something for everyone. And if you're not satisfied with your order for any reason, you can return it for a full refund within 45 days. You have to be in your underwear all day long, so you deserve to be in something really comfortable, and that's where MeUndies really stands out from the rest. And it's no surprise that MeUndies has over 90,000 5-star reviews with over 33 million pairs sold. If you want to get your hands on some of those limited time Halloween prints, I recommend doing it now before it's too late. And right now, as a viewer of this channel, you can get cozy and spooky for less with deals up to 50% off at MeUndies.com/summer and enter promo code SUMMER. That's MeUndies.com/summer, promo code SUMMER for 50% off. A big thank you to MeUndies for sponsoring this video, and now let's get into the case. Arvin Shreve was born in 1930 in Ogden, Utah, and he grew up in a very religious Mormon family. Arvin has been described as shy and intelligent. He was a good student, he was popular, he was on the debate team, and he won multiple awards. And from a young age, Arvin had a natural ability to pull people in and to get them on his side, which was definitely a skill that he uses later in life. He was elected student body president in high school. He was also chosen to be on the seminary council at his church. And we don't really know much about his family or what kind of home life he had, but there is a chance that there was some sexual abuse occurring within the family. Arvin once told a friend that his aunt had repeatedly sexually assaulted him throughout his childhood. Arvin's attitude toward this abuse, though, was pretty strange. He told his friend that he actually liked being abused by his aunt. He said that it was something that he really enjoyed, but unfortunately, that's all we know about the situation. So after Arvin graduated high school, he attended Weber College. Then when he turned 20 years old, he went on a mission trip. He was sent to Brazil on this mission. He was there for a few years, and then when he returned home, he married a woman named Joan Williamson in 1953. They got married in the Salt Lake LDS Temple, and they went on to have 6 children. Arvin got a job with the Parks Department. He had a passion for parks and landscaping. He was known for creating these really amazing landscapes. He helped design many of the parks in the area. He was constantly in the newspaper for all of his work in the Parks Department. I found so many old articles about him. Arvin eventually became a Sunday school teacher at the church, and his classes were so popular popular that people would literally have to stand out in the hallway listening because the room was always full up. This led him to start hosting a Bible study group outside of the church once or twice a week, and this became just as popular as his Sunday school classes. And from the outside, things seem to be going really well for the Shreve family. Arvin is this well-known, upstanding member of the community. He's got this great job where he's doing what he loves. He and Joan are raising their kids in the church that they had grown up in and loved. Everything just kind of seemed perfect. And so no one suspected that Arvin actually had a dark side. First of all, Arvin had a very, very strong hold over his family. He was extremely controlling over his wife and children. From the beginning of their marriage, his wife Joan had been expected to just obey everything he said without question, and the kids were raised the exact same way. Arvin also developed a porn addiction, and it just got worse and worse as time went on. He was also constantly cheating on his wife, and he became a regular for some of the local sex workers. There was one sex worker in particular that was a favorite of Arvin's, and she's known in this case as Melanie, but I'm not sure if that's her real name or not. Now, Arvin had visited Melanie dozens of times, and he had always been very kind to her. She said that he was very gentle, he was shy, he never even said a swear word around her. She described him as a bad Mr. Rogers figure. He wasn't someone that she viewed as a potential threat. But then one day during one of their meetups, Arvin asked Melanie if she could set him up with another sex worker, but he wanted someone on the younger side. This made Melanie uncomfortable, but she said that she did know someone. There was a 16-year-old girl that she knew was doing sex work because she had recently run away from home and she was just trying to get by. And Arvin was like, okay, perfect, set it up, which Melanie did. But it gets worse because after he had sex with the vulnerable 16-year-old, he then went back to Melanie and asked her if she could set him up with someone even younger. He told her that he was looking for someone closer to 14 years old. And when Melanie said no, she was not going to help him find a 14-year-old girl to sleep with, he then asked if she would let him have sex with her young daughter. Thankfully, Melanie refused, but she herself did continue meeting up with Arvin for sex. Arvin did eventually get busted soliciting sex workers and he was arrested. Now, I went through tons of old newspaper articles and I couldn't find any further information about this arrest. So I'm not sure how widely known it was that the arrest happened at all. Like nothing seemed to really come of it. And he just went right back to his everyday life. And when his wife Joan found out about all of this, she forgave him. Arvin told Joan that God had come to him and told him that he had to have sex with those women in order to gain more sexual knowledge. He said that he didn't really want to do it, but he had to because God told him to. So like I said, after this, Arvin just went on with his life. He continued with his position at the Parks Department. He continued soliciting sex workers. He continued holding his Bible study groups. But after a while, Arvin's talk during the Bible study started to get a little bizarre. He started talking a lot about plural marriage. Polygamy apparently was something that Arvin had always been interested in. He had researched the church's history with polygamy extensively. So at first, these comments were taken as more of like a history lesson, but then Arvin started talking more and more about it. And it soon became clear that he was not teaching about it, he was advocating for it. Now, the mainstream Mormon church does not condone polygamy. That's their official stance. We've talked about this a few times on this channel because there just so happens to be a lot of cults that are started by Mormon splinter groups. I'm not going to go into the whole history behind the LDS church breaking away from plural marriage. The key takeaway here is that it's something that the mainstream church does not condone. And if the leaders find out that a member is practicing or advocating for it, they face excommunication. So when the bishop found out what Arvin had been talking about with his Bible group, he brought him in for a meeting. But like I said, Arvin was a very popular figure in the church. He'd been there for his entire life. Everyone really liked him. And I think this is why the bishop just kind of gave him a second chance. He decided to just let him off with a warning. He told him to stop with all of the polygamy talk and to just get back to the basics. But instead of just like taking this slap on the wrist, if you can even call it that, as a win, Arvin looked the bishop in the eye and said, I have received a message from God, and God told me that polygamy is actually the way. And he said that it's my mission to bring polygamy back into the LDS church. Now, the bishop was pretty shocked that not only was Arvin pro-plural marriage, but he was also claiming he could speak directly to God, essentially implying that he's a prophet. The bishop threatened excommunication, and Arvin did eventually back off, and he promised that he would stop talking about polygamy, but he actually had no intentions of stopping. He continued to hold his Bible study groups, and he continued to talk about polygamy. And of course, the bishop eventually found out, and Arvin was finally excommunicated. And this is when he decided to start his own own twisted religion, a religion that taught that assaulting children is what God wanted. This was the start of the Zion Society cult. Arvin Shreve was a deeply disturbed man who wanted to be worshipped by his followers. He wanted total sexual dominance over his followers, and most of all, he wanted to abuse very young children. And he thought, what better way to constantly have kids at his disposal than to start a cult, lure in vulnerable families, and then position himself as the ultimate power. Over the years, Arvin managed to recruit about 120 members into his cult. This was a nice, quiet suburban neighborhood, and Arvin and the cult literally took over a large portion of this subdivision and turned it into a compound. Now, this did not happen overnight. It took multiple years for Arvin to build up his following. The cult actually wasn't fully established until the early 80s when Arvin was in his 50s. He began by organizing a new Bible study group where he would teach his own disturbing form of religion, and he would invite family members, friends, neighbors to come join the Bible study group, and he would slowly try to pull them in. Most of the new recruits were women. Many were single mothers who needed help. Some of them had no family to turn to. Some had been shunned by the LDS church for whatever reason. Some were just trying to escape abusive marriages and find a safe place for their kids. There were some couples that joined, although Arvin was careful to keep the number of men recruits down, and Arvin would lure his followers in with promises of a stronger relationship with God and a safe place for them to live. He told everyone that he was a prophet, he had a direct line to God, and his central talking point, of course, was polygamy. Polygamy was the only way to get into heaven. Now, let's talk a little bit about how this compound was set up. Like I said, it was in the middle of this suburban neighborhood, and there were 14 houses that belonged to the cult within the Northwood subdivision. However, we only have information about 10 of the houses, and so those are the only ones that I'll be talking about. I'm going to put a photo on the screen so you can see where each house was and what it was used for. This was created by a man named Mike King, and we'll talk more about Mike later. He was an investigator who wrote a book about this case. Now, this was a brand new subdivision when Arvin started buying up these homes, so he went in and strategically handpicked the houses that made the most sense for his dream cult compound. So right as you enter the subdivision, you see a house labeled as Sentry, meaning that there were guards there. So Arvin strategically chose those houses because that was the entrance into the subdivision, and he wanted a guard to be right there watching as people came and went. One of the male cult members was stationed here in the Sentry house, and this person was in charge of stockpiling weapons in preparation for the end of the world, because of course this cult was not only a sex cult, it was also a doomsday cult. This person was essentially the head of their little paramilitary group, and he was trained in martial arts. He was also in charge of the cult's very extensive surveillance network. He could basically see anything that was going on within the subdivision from that house. Then across the street from the guardhouse, you'll see a house labeled medical. This is where the cult stored any medical supplies and medications that they could get their hands on. They had a library where they stored religious books, books about guns, books about survival. Then there was another cult house with a bunker in the back, but we still don't know exactly what that bunker was used for. It could have just been part of their doomsday prepping, or it could have been another place where the abuse took place, or both. We don't really know. Then there was the Inspiration Home. This is the home where they held meetings with potential members. A lot of abusive things happened in this house. Next door was the children's dorm, and this is where the young children lived. The girls who lived here ranged in age from 2 years old to 18 years old. As soon as a new family would arrive, they would separate the children from their parents, and then they would place them in the children's dorm. And the children would only get to see their parents on very rare occasions, so maybe like twice a year. Arvin wanted the children separated from their parents as soon as possible in an attempt to kill that bond, to make it even easier for him and the others to manipulate and abuse the children. Of course, Arvin had his own house where he lived with his legal wife Joan and his spiritual wives, and this was the only house that had access to a phone. None of the other homes had a phone, meaning that the members had no way of calling their families or anyone. They couldn't call for help, and some of the houses had carpeting installed on the walls as soundproofing, and you'll understand why they did this when we get into everything later. Now, the beliefs in the cult were very much centered around polygamy, of course, and like many polygamous cults, Arvin used his doctrine to sexually assault people. He established what he called the Sister Council, and Arvin, along with a few other men in the cult, were each given a sister council. The sister councils were families made up of women and girls. Arvin would decide which sister council each woman and child was put into, and they were considered the spiritual wives of the head of their council. There were about 30 men in the cult, and they were called the priesthood, and each of them had at least 3 wives in their sister council. Except for Arvin, he had way more than 3. I've seen conflicting reports of how many wives Arvin actually had, but I do know that it was at least 18. Some reports have the youngest of Arvin's wives as only 2 years old.
He had free reign over them to do whatever he wanted.
What does that mean?
Sexually, psychologically, physically.
28 women?
Yes.
He had at his disposal?
Yes.
What is the age range of these 28 women?
The youngest one is 2 years old, and the oldest, I believe, is 59.
This 61-year-old gardener had free reign to do anything he wants, you say, over 28 women ranging in age from 59 to 2?
Yes.
Unbelievable.
And the things that went on within these sister councils is unbelievably disturbing. So first of all, the women and girls were expected to be perfect in every way. Arvin wanted them all kept at specific weights, and he said that staying at this certain weight would help them to be closer to God and get into heaven. And if they went over that weight, they would be severely punished. One of the survivors said that she was told God can't reach you through your layers of fat. They also had to dress perfectly all the time. There was never like a sweatshirt and joggers kind of day. There were only dresses and skirts unless they were working in the garden. And if they were working out in the garden, Arvin made them wear tiny shorts. They had to have perfect makeup, perfect hair, perfect everything. Arvin wanted his own little collection of women and girls that fit his version of the perfect wife. I've seen several comparisons to the Stepford Wives, and that is the exact image that I had in my head when I was researching this case. Just a collection of these like perfect little like mannequin looking women. Arvin also demanded that all of the cult houses be kept pristine at all times, just in case Jesus wanted to show up for a visit. Nothing out of place. He wanted everything organized meticulously. Everything had to be facing the right direction at just the right angle. And as time went on, Arvin became increasingly more controlling over the women. They weren't allowed to leave the compound without permission, and they had to have at least 2 other cult members with them wherever they went to prevent anyone from leaving or like trying to tip off anyone in the community. None of the women ever got to think for themselves or make any of their own decisions. The men made all the decisions for them.
They work where he wants them to work. They give him all of their money. They believe that everything he brings to them is straight from God. So you can imagine, once the mind's been twisted, you disobey something Arvin says, then you've got these other sisters saying, what's your problem? You just disobeyed God. You've just disobeyed your master.
But the most disturbing aspect of this cult was the rampant sexual abuse. He came up with something he called the sexual way of life. And this was totally centered around teaching women the proper way to please the men. He created an instruction manual with tons of pornographic images included. Arvin said that he spent $40,000 on pornographic images just to include in this manual. And every female member of the cult had to study this religiously. And then they had to practice what they saw on each other. In order to prepare the women to properly satisfy their husbands, they were required to perform various sex acts on one another. And I'm not going to get too graphic, but basically anything you can imagine, they were doing it to each other. They used various types of toys. They used other objects. This would happen one-on-one. This would sometimes happen in group sessions. And Arvin told them that this is what God wanted them to do, that they had to do this in order to achieve a higher calling and be closer to God, because the most important thing a woman could do is please a man. But it actually gets so much more disturbing, because Arvin believed that this sexual way of life doctrine should be taught at a very young age. And so he started demanding that the women teach the little girls as well. We are talking like 6-year-old children being forced to participate in this. The older women would train the children. And of course, this isn't training, this is abuse. But in their mind, they were training the children to learn to satisfy a man. And so the adults would abuse the girls day in and day out. There was never a moment of peace. And over time, the older girls were forced to teach the sexual way of life to the younger girls. So it would be like a 15-year-old girl forced to abuse a 6-year-old girl. That 15-year-old would have started out as a victim herself, but now she's being forced to be the abuser, which has caused so much psychological damage to the survivors. And I'm not blaming the older girls, because it is not their fault. They are also being abused. But I can't imagine the guilt that these girls felt. And sometimes the younger children would be forced to perform sex acts on each other. The adults would show them what to do, and then they would send them into a room and they would make them practice on each other. They would also make the children watch the adults have sex. And this would happen daily, sometimes multiple times per day. It just makes me sick to think about. Arvin would sometimes take the children for late night car rides, and he would abuse them during these car rides. Sometimes he would pull over and make the girls get out and do like an exotic dance for him. And then he would take them to go get ice cream. cream. And now we need to introduce one of the more despicable characters of this story, a woman named Sharon Kapp. Sharon became Arvin's second in command. She was put in charge of the women and they had to obey her just like they obeyed Arvin. She had even helped Arvin establish a lot of the teachings in the cult, like the Sexual Way of Life instructional manual. She helped him to author that. She was also instrumental in recruiting new members into the cult. She was in charge of delivering messages to the girls from Arvin, or if Arvin had any complaints, Sharon was the one who would reprimand them, and she could be extremely brutal. And Sharon was responsible for many, many instances of sexual abuse on the children. But she hadn't always been so scary and predatory. Before meeting Arvin, Sharon had been a mild-mannered housewife, raising her children, going to church. But after her family moved into a new neighborhood, she became friends with a young couple that lived next door. And this is when Sharon started acting really weird. She became more judgy, she was loud, she was aggressive, she would shame people for being sinful. She started dressing differently, she started wearing nothing but dresses and skirts. And her family and friends, of course, they noticed this massive change in her personality and they were pretty worried. Sharon was constantly begging her husband Jeff to meet with her and her new friends, and she was always talking about this older man named Arvin Shreve and how he had changed her life, and she was so happy and she wanted Jeff to experience this too. Now at first Jeff refused to go with her. He was just really creeped out by the whole thing, but eventually things were starting to get so weird that he decided he probably needed to go check it out just to see who the hell this Arvin guy was. So one day Jeff and Sharon go over to the compound, and as they walk in, they're greeted by some of the women, and these women were dressed exactly like Sharon, all in dresses. Jeff and Sharon go into the house, they sit down on the couch, and then Arvin comes in. And Arvin instructs his teenage daughter to sit right between Jeff and Sharon, which made Jeff very uncomfortable, but Sharon didn't seem to mind. So Arvin gives a little rundown about the group. Jeff does not like what he is hearing and he's really weirded out and he just wants to get out of there. And so after Arvin was done talking, Jeff awkwardly thanks him and then he tells Sharon that it's time to leave. And as they were driving home, Sharon says that she really wants their family to move to the compound so they could become full-fledged members of Arvin's group. And she told Jeff that if he would agree to moving, Arvin said that he could have his daughter as a second wife. And then it made total sense why Arvin had instructed his daughter to sit in between Jeff and Sharon. Jeff was like, "No, are you crazy? We're absolutely not moving there. Those people are weird." This caused tensions to get pretty high between Jeff and Sharon. And so Jeff decided that he needed to clear his head. This whole thing was just stressing him out. And so he decided to go on a little weekend trip with some friends. And when he returned home a few days later, the house was empty. Sharon was gone. The kids were gone. Not only that, but Jeff found out that Sharon had attempted to drain their bank accounts, which thankfully he was able to put a stop to that before it happened. But she took their kids and she moved in with Arvin, and Sharon quickly climbed the ranks and became one of Arvin's most loyal followers. She was all in and she became second in command. The kids in the cult referred to Sharon as the alpha dog because they were so scared of her. She was Arvin's enforcer for the women and the children, and she also became kind of like the main recruiter. She was always on the hunt for new people to pull into the group, and she went on to train up many of the young girls in the sexual way of life. Sharon herself was responsible for hundreds of sexual assaults on the children. And this next part is so disturbing. I could not believe this when I read it. So Sharon was always coming up with like little techniques to train the girls in the sexual way of life. And one of the things she came up with was a game called Rape in the Dark. And it is just as horrific as it sounds. The game would be played in the dark basement of the children's dormitory. Adults and children participated in this game, and they would each get a card. And one of the cards would have the word rape written on it. And if you got that card, you had to be the rapist. As the game progressed, the rapist would be allowed to violate whoever they wanted in whatever way they wanted. A lot of these kids had either been born in the cult or brought in at a very young age, and this is all they knew. All they knew was constant abuse. Sharon even started trafficking some of the younger girls to men outside of the cult. I was able to find the actual real names of two of the men. One of the men was Mark Litchfield of Wellsville, Utah, and the other was Brian McMahon of Ogden. And Sharon would connect with these guys. They would discuss which services would be performed during these meetups. They would decide on a price. She would then handpick which of the children would be assaulted, drive them over to the men's houses where the girl would be forced to perform whatever sex act had been decided beforehand, and Sharon herself would either watch while this happened or she would join in on the assault. Sharon would often choose her own daughter to be the victim, which means that she would join in during the assault of her own daughter. She was raping her own daughter. And this was just one of the really evil ways that the cult was making money. They were careful to target single moms or moms who were wanting out of marriages, like I said. Part of the reason they did this is because they, could extort money from the ex-husbands. Many of the ex-husbands would track their wives down and demand to see their children. And if that child happened to be a boy, Arvin would basically sell the child back to his father. Arvin didn't want boys at the compound, and so he was willing to sell them off to a desperate father in order to make a profit. And if one of the women gave birth to a boy, she would be forced to give him up.
He had so much power over these women that 2 women out there who were going through divorce left their husbands to join this group. And ironically, both women, their children were both, they had children that were boys, no girls. And Arvin made them give him up.
He didn't want boys there.
He does not want boys there, and they did.
A scenario painfully similar to the so-called Lost Boys of Colorado City.
Now, there were times when young boys would visit the compound, and they would be abused as well. There was one child who was there to visit a relative, and while he was there, he was assaulted by one of the men in the group. Arvin was accused of assaulting a young boy as well. This was something that he would never admit to, but I 100% believe that he did it. But it was like nothing was ever enough for Arvin or Sharon. They were always wanting more money, more sex, more recruits. And so Arvin started teaching something that he called finding the thread. Each male member of the cult that had his own sister council would have a common thread, and they would look for this common thread while they were hunting for new recruits. So for example, one of the men was given the common thread of high heels, and so he would go to shoe stores and lurk around like a creep until he saw an attractive woman looking at high heels. He would then have one of the women from his sister council go over to the woman and start up a friendly conversation in the hopes that they would hit it off and the woman would accept an invitation to dinner or to Bible study or something. Now, Arvin's common thread was lingerie, and so he would do the exact same thing. He would go to a department store, lurk around the lingerie section like a creep until he spotted some poor unsuspecting woman. He would send over one of his wives and she would attempt to recruit that person. And if someone new ever moved into the neighborhood, they would be over at that house acting super neighborly, super welcoming. They would offer to do yard work for free, and they would do extensive work, like totally new landscaping and everything. There was one couple that moved into the neighborhood and the members immediately pounced. They started doing all kind of favors for this couple. They did free yard work. They completely remodeled their basement. And in exchange, they would ask the couple to come over for Bible study, where of course they were trying to recruit them. Arvin told the wife that God wanted her to be in his sister council. He pulled out the Sexual Way of Life manual and showed them all of the explicit photos. Thankfully, that couple ended up selling their house and leaving the community just to get away from them. But can you imagine living in this nice, quiet suburban neighborhood and knowing that most of your neighbors are in a cult? Arvin also required the women to go out and get jobs, and they had to hand over a large portion of their earnings to Arvin as tithing. And when they weren't working outside of the house, they were doing chores around the house, cooking, cleaning, gardening, and they were also working the cult lingerie business. This business was called Sweet Things, and they ran it out of one of the cult houses, and all of the lingerie was designed and produced by the women. And they would even model the lingerie. But not just the women would model the lingerie, they also made the underage girls do this too. They would be forced to put on tiny pieces of lingerie and walk like they were on the catwalk. They would invite potential customers to come over to look at the lingerie, and they would have the girls model it for them as if they were in a fashion show. And we actually have footage of one of these little fashion shows. I'm gonna blur it out so you won't really be able to see much of anything. I just kind of want you to get the vibe of what this was like. It's just so weird and creepy.
Arvin Shreve was inside his well-tended homes, directing his female followers in a rather unusual business pursuit, producing their own personal line of skimpy lingerie, as this video shows. Items marketed under the name of Sweet Things, clothing that was often sold to local strippers, who in turn would come to Arvin Shreve's homes to instruct Shreve's followers on ways of gratifying their leader.
They would try to sell the lingerie to the exotic dancers in the area. And one dancer they got to be really close with was a woman named Marley. Some of the cult women had went out to a strip club one night and they spotted Marley and they knew they wanted to recruit her. So they asked Marley if she would be interested in getting free handmade lingerie for her shows in exchange for some dance lessons, and Marley agreed. So every Sunday morning for 4 months, Marley went over to the compound to teach erotic dance lessons to the women. And everything seemed to be going well with this little arrangement. Like, Marley was getting something out of it. She was getting free lingerie and she didn't mind the women. They seemed nice enough. But then they started having the children come in. Marley started to notice young children were being brought into the room to watch her dance. They were forcing the little girls to watch the lesson so they could learn how to dance provocatively. Then one day Arvin attempted to recruit Marley because that was kind of their end game with her. They wanted her to join the cult, but it did not go the way that Arvin had hoped because Marley was not buying anything that he said. She pretty much told him that it all sounded dumb, and then that was pretty much the end of their relationship. Now, in addition to all of the horrific sexual abuse happening within the cult, the children were also being forced to do some strange things. Like they were given a pen and paper and they would have to go into a dark room and they were expected to communicate with the dead. And this dead person was supposed to tell them a story or give them a piece of information. They were supposed to write it down and then hand it in. But of course, they could not communicate with the dead, and so they would ultimately just make something up. The children were also locked in a tiny room under the stairs as punishment. Sometimes they would be forced to sit for very long periods of time without moving a muscle. They could only move their eyes. And they were also forced to pose nude for photos and also perform various sex acts on video. Arvin was adding all of this to his disgusting, extensive collection of CSAM. This place was literally hell on earth and there was no end in sight. But then one day Sharon made a mistake and she recruited someone who would ultimately become the Zion Society's downfall. This person has been given the pseudonym Erin in the book that I read about this case, but she has spoken out publicly about the cult in interviews using her real name. So I feel like it's okay to call her by her real name, which is Corey Christopherson. And Corey was a young mother who had a 6-year-old daughter with another child on the way, and her marriage was falling apart. Her husband's name was Mark, and they were on the brink of divorce. At least Corey was on the verge of filing for divorce. Corey worked at a salon owned by her Aunt Judy, and it was a hair and nail salon, and they also had like tanning beds and stuff. And unfortunately, Sharon and some of the other cult members became regulars at this salon. Corey and Judy struck up a friendship with the women. Of course, they had no idea they were in a cult. To them, they were just regular everyday ladies coming in for beauty appointments. Slowly over time, they got closer and closer, and the cult members started inviting Judy and Corey over for dinner. Again, nothing suspicious to note, just looked like a nice house in a nice neighborhood. It all seemed so normal. Now, Sharon really had her eye on Corey. She was young, she was pretty, and Sharon also knew that Corey had a 6-year-old daughter, and so she thought that Corey would make a perfect addition to Arvin's collection. So after a while, Sharon started only inviting Corey over without her Aunt Judy, and this is when they pounced. One night, Corey was over for a visit. More women showed up, like women she hadn't seen before. All of these women were dressed the same as Sharon and the others. They were all in dresses. They all had perfect hair, perfect makeup. They all looked like clones. Sharon introduced them as neighbors, and they all just started chatting about life and kids and stuff. They started asking Corey about her marital issues. So Corey started opening up. She started telling them about how she really wanted out of her marriage, but she was worried about being a single mother. They knew that this was their opening to reel her in because they told Corey that they totally understood her situation because they had been there too. And the only thing that had saved them was their friend group, aka the cult. They told her how they leaned on each other, how they provided financial support and childcare for one another, and they made it sound like this really amazing group of women that just like bonded together and helped each other. And then they made Corey an offer that she felt like she couldn't refuse. They offered her the same support. They said that she could live with them, they would help her to raise her daughter and her unborn baby, and it would all be free of charge. They described it as a place of refuge free of contention, strife, or financial worry. Unfortunately, Corey completely fell for this without telling anyone, not her husband, not her Aunt Judy, no one. She took her daughter and she moved onto the compound. And this marked the beginning of the strangest and most disturbing 15 months of Corey and her daughter's lives. Corey and her daughter basically vanished. No one knew where they were, but Judy thought she might know. where Corey was. And after a phone call to Sharon, she confirmed that she was right. Corey was with them. So Corey's husband, Mark, and her Aunt Judy and Judy's daughter, they all went over to the compound to see what was going on. This devolved into a very heated, very chaotic scene. Judy and her daughter went up to the door and knocked while Mark stayed in the truck. They really didn't want him to get out because, things were so weird between him and Corey anyways, so they thought it would be best if he stayed in the truck. So Judy and her daughter go up to the door and they're greeted by an older man, and they didn't realize at the time that was Arvin Shreve. They asked Arvin if he knew where Corey was, and he said he didn't. He said she's not here at the moment. And so they asked if they could see Corey's daughter. Judy just had a really weird feeling about all of this, and she wanted to make sure that the child was okay. Arvin agreed. I'm sure he was just trying to keep any suspicions at bay, and so he was trying to act as normal as possible. And so he led Judy and her daughter across the street to another house, and they walked in. And as soon as they walked in, they see all these women, dressed nicely. They let Judy see Corey's daughter, and she immediately knew that something was wrong because this little girl loved Judy. They were very close, but she was acting very standoffish. Like, she wasn't really looking at Judy. She was acting shy. Like, something wasn't right. And Judy knew that she needed to get her out of there immediately. And so she said, let's go have a talk and we'll go get some ice cream. And she grabs the little girl by her hand and she started to walk out of the house. And that's when chaos erupted. The women started screaming for Arvin. Arvin comes running in. He sees Judy and her daughter trying to leave with Corey's daughter. He then hits Judy's daughter in the face and then pushes Judy against the wall and then forces them out of the house. The police were called, and I cannot believe that I'm saying this, but they totally took Arvin's side. They believed everything Arvin and the women told them, basically that Judy and her daughter had come in and tried to kidnap the little girl, even after all of the other complaints that they had received from ex-husbands of the members. In fact, they threatened Judy and Mark that if they ever showed back up to the house, they would be arrested for trespassing. Corey did eventually show up in the middle of all the chaos, and as soon as she stepped out of the car, Sharon ran outside, grabbed her, and pulled her into the house before Judy or Mark could talk to her. And Sharon started telling Corey all of this stuff that wasn't true, that Judy was trying to kidnap her daughter and that she was conspiring with Mark and filling her head with all of these terrible things. And unfortunately, Corey believed it. And she told the officers that she had a message for her aunt and her husband, that she never wanted to see them again. And this incident kind of worked in Arvin and Sharon's favor. They wanted to make Corey hate her family because they were on a crusade to turn her against her family. And so they just continued to tell her all kinds of lies, saying that her family had turned against her. They all hated her now. And Corey has said for the first month or so after moving onto the compound that she was in a total fog. She said that her memory of that first month is very fuzzy, and she's convinced that she was being drugged. And while Corey was living in this very foggy state, her 6-year-old daughter was taken from her and moved into the children's dorm, and we all know what happens down there. After about a month, Corey started feeling better, likely because they stopped drugging her, and this is when they put her through training. They started revealing all of their twisted beliefs. She was placed in Arvin's sister council where she was taught the sexual way of life. She was forced to repeatedly have sex with the women as practice to make her perfect for Arvin. She also witnessed the rape in the dark game, and she was so disturbed by what she saw that she ran out of the basement and was literally shaking. Corey knew from early on that she wanted out of this cult, but she felt trapped. Remember, there are no phones in the houses. They're being surveilled constantly by cameras and by the other cult members. They also have her daughter somewhere in one of the other houses, and so Corey really felt stuck.
I think of Arvin's group and I think of Jonestown, when that one man had power enough to convince 400 people, men, women, and children, to kill themselves. And
Did Arvin Shreve had that kind of power over this group?
yeah, he did.
Now, you might be wondering how no one has caught on to what's happening in the Northwood subdivision. Well, it turns out that police had been told multiple times, mostly by ex-husbands, that something creepy was happening over there. In the book I read about this case, the author, Mike King, said that the weird rumors that were spreading around town about the Northwood subdivision became seen as something less fact and more like urban legend. Like, people knew that there was something weird happening over there, but it wasn't anything that people really took seriously, which is unfortunate. Anytime an ex-husband would call the cops, they were basically told there was nothing that they could do about it, that they had to take it up with the courts. And so nothing was ever done. Arvin had trained the women and children on what to say to the police if they ever did show up. They were very good at convincing officers that everything was normal. And it didn't help that from the outside, the houses looked so neat and tidy, perfectly manicured lawns. The children were clean and nicely dressed. Over time, Arvin Arvin started to become even more paranoid. The security ramped up. He instructed members to take incriminating items from inside the house and put them in their cars in case the houses were raided. He also had a ton of CSAM destroyed. They were like burning photos and videos. They started holding meetings where the men would dress up like police officers and pretend like they were raiding the compound. They even bought some of those anatomical dolls that therapists use when they're interviewing victims of abuse. You know, like the dolls that they say like point to where you were touched. They called them devil's dolls, and they told the children that they were possessed by demons and never to touch them. And they did this, of course, so that if they were ever questioned using that type of doll, they would be terrified. Arvin taught the women and children how to shoot a gun. They had tons of guns on the compound. They installed alarm systems throughout the house. Like, Arvin was a ball of nerves because he was convinced that they were going to be raided soon. And he wasn't wrong, because thankfully, after 15 months in the cult, Corey was able to escape, and she went to the police with her story. On July 10th, 1991, Corey walked into the Ogden police station and talked to Detective Mike King, and over the course of 3 hours, she told him her story. Now, like I said, police had actually heard about a weird group living in the Northwood subdivision, and nothing ever came of it, but now they had Corey, a former member, telling them about all of this abuse going on. She had a first-hand account of what had happened. Detective King dove headfirst into this investigation. He started talking to ex-husbands, getting warrants, and in less than a month, he was ready to make some arrests. In the early morning hours of August 2nd, 1991, the police descended onto the compound. They all got into position outside of each of the cult houses, and they forced their way inside. Thankfully, none of the many weapons that the cult had in their possession were used that day, and everything actually went pretty smoothly. There were about 120 cult members taken in, and this included 32 children. The children were taken into custody, they were questioned, and one thing that the investigators found strange was how the children reacted to the anatomical dolls. They were shown an anatomical doll so they could point to where they had been touched, and as soon as they saw that doll, they completely freaked out. After interviewing the victims, it's estimated that the number of rapes that occurred in this cult over the course of a decade is likely close to 4,000. Now, Arvin was not there the morning of the raid. He was the only notable person missing. I guess he got worried after Corey left. Maybe he assumed that the police would be showing up soon. I'm not really sure what he was thinking, but he went on the run for 3 days before he ultimately turned himself in about 300 miles south of Ogden in a town called Cedar City. And shockingly, Arvin confessed. He told police that he had assaulted the girls. Of course, he didn't call it assaults. He said that, he had had sex with them. And he also made sure to blame the girls. He would say that the girls had initiated it. He was willing to admit to having sex with them, but he wasn't willing to admit that he had forced them into it. And he never would admit to assaulting any of the boys, even though, like I said, he had been accused of abusing the boys as well. In total, there were almost 800 counts of sexual abuse, with Arvin being responsible for 400 of those counts, and Sharon charged with 113 counts. And the other women in the council were responsible for 226 counts, and 18 of those counts went against the 2 men that were not in the cult, the 2 that were paying to abuse the young girls. Now, back when this case broke, any victim of sexual assault had to testify in a preliminary hearing, which meant that the children would have to testify over and over again for each of the people charged. Not only was this going to be an extremely traumatic experience for these kids, but because they had each been assaulted literally hundreds of times by multiple cult members, it made it nearly impossible for them to remember specific instances of abuse. So the defense lawyers would get really aggressive with them and try to trip them up. I know of one defense lawyer in particular who was very aggressive during questioning. In the clip that I'm about to show you, you'll see a woman named Rebecca Johnson walking with her lawyer. Rebecca is referred to as one of the high-ranking members of the cult, and this clip shows her and her asshole defense lawyer, whose name is Brian Florence. They have just come from a preliminary hearing where Brian Florence has just very aggressively interrogated one of the child victims. And I want you to listen to what he says when the reporter asks him about the hearing.
A bizarre tale of sex in an Ogden courtroom and a grueling ordeal for a young witness. Defense attorneys fired tough questions at a teenage girl today who claims she was sexually abused in Ogden's Zion Society. 43-year-old Becky Johnson is charged with aggravated sexual abuse of a child. Courts reporter Paul Murphy was at her preliminary hearing today.
According to today's testimony, Becky Johnson was third in charge in the Zion Society and in charge of the religious sect's finances. During cross-examination, Johnson's attorney grilled the young girl who charges Johnson with molesting her.
I didn't consider it tough at all. She hasn't seen anything yet.
Florence wanted the accuser to give exact details about what happened and when it happened. The young witness said it was hard to remember specific acts of sexual abuse because she says she was abused thousands of times by a lot of people and that it happened every day. It just happened and happened and happened, the teenage girl testified. Still, she remembered 2 events with Johnson specifically and at least 25 accounts of abuse in general. The sexual was supposed to be the spiritual, she said, and added that Johnson was often her teacher. Touching was a religious issue to bond the sisters together. The hearing ended with Johnson bound over for trial and the accuser's stepmother accusing the defense attorney of victimizing her daughter a second time.
He just was real aggressive and I felt he was a little ruthless there. She's just a child.
And the smug smile on Rebecca's face, she looks so happy with herself when she knows that that girl was telling the truth. These people are truly disgusting. There was also a 6-year-old boy who had to testify at one of these hearings, and the defense was so aggressive in his questioning that he had this child crying and literally curled up in the fetal position. It was so bad that they had to stop the hearing and the boy was not able to continue. And since he wasn't able to testify, the charges against that particular cult member were dropped. The children had been assaulted hundreds of times. Some of them estimate up to 600 times. How are they expected to recall the details of each of the assaults? It happened so often that the details of each attack morphed into like one giant dark cloud in their memories. They could not keep track of who had done what, and that is heartbreaking. The mental state of some of the child survivors was so touch and go, especially in the first couple of years when these trials would have been taking place, that after 2 years, the decision was made to just stop prosecuting because they felt like they were just traumatizing these children over and over again every time they had to testify. So unfortunately, some of the members did not face justice. Arvin ended up confessing to more than 30 counts of sexual assault against the girls, and during one of his interviews with Arvin, Detective King asked him how often the abuse occurred, and this was his response. It was a daily thing. If I asked you what you had for breakfast last week on Thursday, you wouldn't know. You would know that you had breakfast, just not what and where. Arvin continued to deny that he had ever touched any of the boys. The prosecutors thought that proving what he had done to the boys would be very difficult since they didn't have a confession. Also, they would have to have this boy testify, which would be very traumatic. Arvin had already confessed to enough to put him behind bars likely for the rest of his life, and so it was decided that they would not pursue charges in the assaults of the boys. And in the end, Arvin pleaded guilty to 2 charges of first-degree felony sodomy on a child and 2 second-degree felonies of sexual abuse of a child. He was sentenced to 20 years to life, and he died in 2009 in the Utah State Prison. Sharon also confessed. She pleaded guilty to sodomy of a child, attempted aggravated sexual abuse, sexual exploitation of a minor, and dealing harmful material to a minor. She was sentenced to 10 years to life. Remember Mark Litchfield and Brian McMahon, the 2 guys that Sharon would traffic the girls to? Well, investigators were able to track them down based on the accounts of some of the teenage victims, and they were both convicted. But Brian McMahon was sentenced to only 30 days in prison, and unfortunately, I was unable to find information on Mark Litchfield's sentence. Most of the women got very light sentences and were released within a year, which is a total slap in the face. And Sharon was paroled after serving 9 years of her sentence. Some of the members got out of prison and found other fringe groups to join. A few of them ended up joining other polygamous groups. Some of the survivors have spoken out publicly about what happened to them. There are so many Zion Society survivor stories that I wish that I could have included in this video, but it would have been like 5 hours long. There are lots of interviews and articles about this cult. If you're interested, I'll leave links down in the description box. I'll also leave a link to Mike King's book. If you're interested in hearing more firsthand accounts and details about this case, I highly recommend Mike's book, especially if you're interested in learning more about the investigation. And that is all I have on this case. Let me know what you guys think about this one down in the comments. Don't forget to check out the description box for the link to try out MeUndies. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and leaving me a comment. That is the easiest way for you to support me and my channel. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.